Good morning, good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the SCCJR seminar series. It's my immense pleasure to chair today's seminar. My name's Michele Burman and I'm a Professor of Criminology here at the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research and based at the University of Glasgow. Okay, the preliminaries out of the way, it remains for me to introduce our speaker, the eminent global criminologist, Professor Kerry Carrington, who is a research professor in the Centre for Justice at QUT in Australia. She is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, a senior counsellor of the Asian Criminological Society, and former vice chair of the Division of Critical Criminology in the American Society of Criminology. She is the founding co-chief editor of the International Journal for Crime, Justice and Social Democracy, Pacific Rim editor of Critical Criminology, and international editorial board member of the journal Criminology and Criminal Justice and Feminist Criminology. In 2014, Kerry received the American Society of Criminology Division of Women and Crime Distinguished Scholar Award in recognition of her contributions to the study and analysis of young women, crime and youth justice over 30 years. In 2014, she received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Society of Criminology, the Division of Critical Criminology. And today, she draws on her groundbreaking work on women-centered police stations in Latin America in a presentation entitled Beyond Criminalising Gender Violence, Are Women-Centered Police Stations a Viable Alternative?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michele. Can you hear me? Okay, it's supposed to be on speaker view, but somehow or other it's not gone onto speaker view. Okay, sorry everybody, I'm just trying to find the speaker view. I can't seem to find it, but I've done something. Okay, well, welcome and thank you very, very much for that very warm and expansive introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and thank you for the invitation and thank you to all those who are giving up their time to hear this. Okay, so the whole of this research has been inspired very much by a huge international research team, where we look to reimagine how we can police gender violence in other parts of the world, but we actually were inspired by going to a place in the global south, actually Argentina, to do this, to look at the victim-centered women's police-led stations, and that emerged there in the 1980s. But before I begin, I do need to actually do a welcome to country. This is traditional in Australia. I acknowledge that the Turrbal and Yagara, as the First Nations owners of the lands where we are now, stands and pay respect to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. Their land was never ceded and in fact it was stolen. Okay. And this absolutely beautiful piece of artwork was designed by Aboriginal artist Keisha Leon for QUT for us to use in our presentations. Now, I want to acknowledge this huge international research team, including Vanessa Ryan and Jay Rogers, who I know are here tonight, and Maria Pujol, who's in lockdown in Argentina still, my Argentinian collaborators. So all the research was initially done in Spanish in Argentina in 2018, 2019, and that was the team with Maria where we collected all the data together. Then I have other collaborators from the Global North, Professor Myrna Dawson, Dr. Elaine Arnold, or actually she's Professor Elaine Arnold, and Maria Cano from the Institute of Criminology. Sorry about that. So I wanted to acknowledge them because you'll see later that there's several stages to this research. And I'm going to start off by giving you some historical perspective on why this research was so necessary, what it aims to do, its conceptual framework, and then I'm going to present you just some of the key findings. And then I'm going to give you a sneak look at the third stage, which is our international study that we've rolled out in Canada and the UK. Okay, so in the 1970s and 1980s, that's when we first saw the criminalisation of gendered violence and also sexual violence and the recognition of rape in marriage. Now, this was at the time largely lauded as a huge victory for feminism. So when countries like Australia and US and UK did this, it was finally seen as a huge feminist victory, that we'd finally got the state to recognised that gender violence wasn't a private matter, it was a public matter, and the state had a responsibility to act on behalf of women to prevent and police and punish that violence. Okay, so, but the problem was historically that at that time, and this was not anticipated, but the entire system for responding to gender violence was then handed over to what I would argue is an ill-equipped, under-trained criminal justice system, male-dominated, in particular by magistrates at that time, but also by men in policing. And so so the whole of the policing of gendered violence was just handed over to a highly masculinist policing system, which had many problems. So what happened? Okay. So what are those? I need to talk about the failings of the traditional models of gender violence, because this is what inspired us to go looking for better models. You really have to understand this. So masculinist cultures thrive in masculinist dominated institutions like the military, like army, like and like police. And police stations are primarily designed to receive offenders. You think about it, that's a police station in Queensland. They're steely, they're unwelcoming, they're meant to make people feel uncomfortable. They're not meant or designed to receive victims. And victims and offenders walk in those same doors and are meant to sit in the same hard, steely seats. And goodness knows what, there's absolutely nowhere to put your children either. So the response to some of this, it was in fact at that time to say, okay, let's just add women. It's the liberal feminist response. Add women and stir. Let's just add women to policing, and somehow or other will radically change the whole culture of policing, the whole force of policing. Well, Silvestri, who's an absolutely incredible scholar of policing and has been for several decades, her recent work has absolutely demonstrated that has failed. Increasing women in law enforcement is not sufficient to change police culture alone. And her research is in fact based on the UK police, where you do have 30% sworn officers female. In Queensland, it's 25%. It's about 25% average in Australia. Now, earlier there was some work by Tim Prenzler and Sinclair that said that, you know, they looked at the evidence of policing worldwide, not just Australia, and they said that it was absolutely failing. It was failing the women, that they couldn't retain women. They had difficulty retaining women, and they especially have difficulty retaining women of Indigenous or minority backgrounds, and that is especially the case today. So what are some of the systemic problems of the policing of gender violence? Now, these are all identified not by me, but by royal commissions, by inquiries, by special task forces, by research after research after research. The research is absolutely damning. It's systematic. Now, this is just the research in Australia, but when you look internationally, it's the same. They lack empathy towards the victims of domestic and sexual violence. They fail to provide women with adequate information. They provide to provide them with emergency resources. They lack referral to appropriate support services. They often engage in victim blaming, and they have a deep-seated reluctance to believe or even take victims' complaints seriously. And they side with perpetrators quite often, and they regard many victims' complaints as too trivial and a waste of police resources. So that's not me saying that. That's all these royal commissions and inquiries, and it's just damning. Okay, so what are some of the other problems then with criminalising gender violence? Well, Tamar Pitch picked this up in 1995, very early on. She's an Italian feminist, and she writes a lot in Spanish, which is how I originally engaged with her work. And I actually met her in Argentina, of all places. But she came up with this. She said, you know what, why are all you feminists so happy about this? Because what is happening is that the criminal justice approach to it privatizes what is in fact a collective problem. So it's not going to resolve it. She also pointed out that victimhood was very ambiguous and that there was too much prospect or possibility for victims to be seen as legitimate or illegitimate, and the only ones that could be seen as legitimate victims were the ones that were passive, you know, white, middle class, whatever. So there was, she picked that up very early. Others since have picked up the problem that mandatory reporting actually removes the agencies of victims and survivors, and it actually replaces their agency with the state. So it's another form of re-traumatizing and it's another way of, in fact, putting women in the same position as they were with their abusers. So it takes power away from them, it doesn't empower them. Then the other huge problem is with the narrowing of the response. So instead of being a collective response as feminists had originally wanted, the whole response became narrowed down to an individualist response, absolutely focused on the individual, on an incident. And then this has meant that the law's inherent emphasis on individual responsibility for discrete acts ill-equips the criminal justice system to deal with gendered, cultural and social dynamics of domestic violence. So this incident-based approach to policing moves the wider context of coercive control, as many commentators have noted, though criminalising that is not necessarily going to be a panacea either, because of these incredible complexities with the policing of gender violence. So Pitch argues that the whole process of criminalising universalises the problem, but it privatises its causes, and this hugely problematic. And then Heather Nancaro, who's done a huge amount of research and is the CEO of ANROS in Australia, she has done research in Queensland, which has found that victims who don't fit these stereotypes, such as women who fight back against their abusers, they're the ones who police erroneously misidentify as perpetrators. And in Australia, many of these turn out to be Indigenous women. And her study was prompted by a death review report in 2017, that absolutely shocking figure that found that almost half of the women killed in a domestic homicide in Queensland in 2017 were misidentified by the Queensland police as perpetrators. That's shocking. It's not incidental, it's systemic. And so then that's led to her research. Okay. So this has led a lot of feminists in particular, but others to reflect, not just feminists, but lots of others to reflect on, well, do we need to break from carceral feminism? Do we need to move on from criminalising domestic violence? Are there other things we can do? And Hammer, Radford and Stenko in 1989, and they're still incredible, leaders in this field. In 1989, they said, gee, isn't it contradictory that feminists are asking the state to take responsibilities for men's violence against women, but noting, and I quote them, that the police are defenders of the existing order, while men's violence plays a central role in upholding male supremacy within that order, and I would also say colonialist and racial supremacy as well, I'd add to that. So the criminalisation of domestic violence relies on policing courts to police patriarchy, a social order upheld by themselves as actors in that system. So this contradiction is what's led to the critiques of the feminist approaches to seek law enforcement approaches to domestic violence. Now, many of the critiques of carceral feminism have come from African American feminists, and and for very good reason, because of the incredible number of Black lives that have been, and women have been murdered by police or killed by police in America. And what they argue, and this is not my argument, they argue that this has made many feminist soldiers in the late 20th century war on crime. So they align feminism with the militarization of the police and the police violence towards African Black communities. I think that's that critique. I agree with some of it, but I think it goes far too far, because we do need a criminal justice response and we don't want a criminal justice response that's racialized or patriarchal, but we do still need one, because women need protecting from men's violence. Okay. But it is very unfortunate that the feminist lobby groups' demands that the state criminalise male violence did in fact coincide with mass incarceration, and particularly drove up rates of imprisonment of African men from marginalised and coloured communities in America. And we could probably say the same in Australia, and that's why I understand why so many women of colour and Black feminists have come out and said we don't want women's police stations, because gee, you know, they'll just repeat these same failings and we don't want them. I get that, I totally get that, but that's not what they do, and I'll explain what they do later. So the very prominent legal theorist Lee Goldbach has called for the decriminalisation of domestic violence, arguing it is a complex problem that requires a multi-dimensional solution. Okay, so I'm going to now talk to you about what that multi-dimensional solution might be. But first, I do want to emphasise the concerns are absolutely valid of Indigenous women, Indigenous communities in Australia. Indigenous women are much more likely to be criminalised as a result of being a victim of domestic violence. In fact, only representing 3.3% of the population, they're 66% of the women in prison as the result of a violation of a domestic violence order in Queensland. It's horrific. Heather Nankoro has also examined the unintended consequences, and she says it's formulaic, it's incidence-based, it's focused on physical violence, and that's had a criminalising impact on Indigenous women and communities. She's said, look, the implementation of the law has lacked genuine intersectionality and is not Indigenous-led, and that this has led to really serious ongoing systemic problems of policing gender violence with Indigenous communities. So I'm not advocating for women's police stations in Indigenous communities, but I am advocating for a trial in non-Indigenous communities. Okay, well, would these costs be worth it if the criminal law really did work? Okay, you might say, oh, all that's worth it if our criminal justice response was working. Well, I can tell you what, in Australia it's not working. Okay, the number of these are rates here are rates of female victims of family domestic violence, and you can see they're massively inclining. Now, some people might say, well, that's just increased reporting. Well, no, it's not just increased reporting, because as you can see from 2002 to 2017, we've had also quite increase in what we call age standardized rates of hospitalization of women who have been assaulted by a partner. So that means that it's a genuine increase. It's not just an increase in reporting, but this is even more damning. This is our homicide rate per 100,000 by type in Australia from 1990 to 2016. This is that you can see here the total homicide rate is dramatic. It's almost halved. Okay, almost halved since 1990. That's good. What's bad is that the rates of domestic homicide, which is this one here, have remained almost, I think it's almost stagnant. Hang on, yeah, particularly since 2009. Now, in 2009, ironically, is when we had a national action plan, our first one to address gender violence against women. And you look, the rates have absolutely plateaued. This here is stranger. The one on the bottom is stranger domestic violence. So women, one woman is killed a week on average, and domestic violence has remained static. This is incredibly worrying. it's what we're calling the national crisis. What's the conceptual framework of our study? Our conceptual framework is very much influenced by intersectionality, which is a concept that was invented by Kimberly Crenshaw, who herself was a Black advocate and activist and feminist in America. And intersectionality comes to things and says, look, you know, there is not just one axis of power in play at any particular moment. It might be gender, it could be multiple overlapping axes of power, race, gender, class, location, etc. Structured poverty. So we need to move beyond those liberal feminist concepts of the placeless, timeless woman. And when you actually interrogate what that was in liberal feminism, very unfortunately, it was a white privileged woman who had the resources to seek justice from a mainly white criminal justice system. So you can see why that Indigenous women in particular have such a problem with policing gendered violence. Okay, our whole research is inspired by Southern theory. I won't say much about this, but Southern theory problematizes the whole kind of idea that only great policy ideas, only great theoretical frameworks, only great ideas come from the global north, where 85% of the resources of the universities and 85% of all the research is done in the world, and that in the global south, like Australia, Latin America, Asia, where our only role in that global episteme of knowledge is to simply test out theories from the global north or apply policy solutions from the global north. That's what we call, Rowan Connell calls that metropolitan thinking. But we use the South as a metaphor for power, and in the same way that Kimberly Crenshaw is using intersectionality as axes of power. So what we're saying is that social theory can be positioned, it can be fluid, it can be produced from the global south, and it does not have to be and the same for policy. And some of the very best policy in criminology has come from Latin America, and especially Argentina. Argentina invented the concept of transitional justice, truth commissions, which then traveled to South Africa, and they used that in post-apartheid, and they've used it all around the world. Argentina is at the forefront of incredibly advanced knowledge systems, but because most of it's in Spanish, it's really hard to access unless you read and speak Spanish. And I've been going there for more than 30 years, so that's how I've become so embedded and know so much about it. Also, my research has always been inspired by Pat Carlin, who says, look, the role of a criminologist is to reimagine the possible. That's our role, because we live in an unequal society and we have to come up with solutions, not just problems. We have to reimagine what's possible. And so that's what we've been trying to do. All right, I better move on. Moving on to the study now. So this is the study. It was, and this was stage 1. Now we were not doing an evaluation. We interviewed 100 employees from 10 women's police stations, 79 police officers, 21 were lawyers, psychologists, 89 were females. Sorry, that figure doesn't add up there. Don't know why. 11 were males. Sorry, that's a mistake. Okay. So these emerged first in 1988, and by 2019 they had 131. There was 1 in 5 police stations in Buenos Aires, the province of Buenos Aires. Actually, 1 in 5 is a specialist police station. Now, okay, but Argentina also has an offensive femicide. Okay, now what's really important to understand about these police stations is that they're specialist police stations. men can and do work in them. They just simply have to have done the training, but they're designed specifically to receive victims and their children. They offer a multidisciplinary response. They have a mandate for prevention, and they do address the structural issue of the whole maleness of policing. And they actually have their own separate command structure. They report to their own commissioner, who reports to the Minister of Security as well as to the Minister for Gender. And those two ministers are responsible. They work from a gender perspective. Now they offer, this is really fundamentally important, they offer women a gateway to services in justice, health, legal counselling, everything. That they offer them a whole gateway to, and they do not just funnel them into the criminal justice system. And in fact, only about a third to a half ever go down that route. And survivors retain their own agency because they decide what happens. And this sidesteps a lot of the problems of criminalisation that I've just spent too much of my time talking about. Okay. There are some papers that I've published which go through how these police stations prevent gender-based violence. Well, they do what most ordinary police stations do. And you can see here that my background is, in fact, this wall. This is the entrance to a women's police station in Argentina. And it says rompe el silencio, which means break the silence. So they often also have yo te creo, and that means I believe you. And these are painted by survivors as murals. They're huge. They're like 20 metres long, 3 metres high. That's what ordinary police stations do, but they do it from a gender perspective, and they do it in multidisciplinary teams. They also work with, they have a mandate, a legislative mandate to work with their teams. They have to actually meet every week with all the local boards and teams. I won't go into the detail, but they have a legislative mandate to work with communities. Now, they do the most amazing preventative work in communities. This is them at Christmas. They know that gendered violence increases at Christmas time. So what they do is they go out a few days before Christmas. They take out lollies and packages that they've gifts that they've been collecting all year, usually donations, and they put on them their business card and also information about domestic violence being a crime, and they hand them out to hundreds and thousands of children and families, particularly in the barrios. This is and they build up trust and rapport. It's a form of what we call trust-based policing. This is me with some of these awesome women, but as you can see, there's multidisciplinary team members. He's a psychologist. You can't see him. He's there. He's the lawyer. And they're just unbelievable. Okay, so what I really wanted to know was what we could learn about that in Australia. I don't have time because I've run past. I don't have time, unfortunately, but I can explain the methods more in the chat. But we did 2 surveys, one with the workforce and one with the community. Oh, we don't have time to go into methods. And we asked 2 key questions. Again, I don't have time to go into methods. I do want to talk about the demographics. Of the workforce survey was basically sent to over 200 organisations, domestic violence sector organisations in Australia that represent a workforce of around 10,000, and they tended to respond as an organisation, as an NGO. And 98% were involved in responding to domestic family violence, and 80% of them also worked with Indigenous peoples, but that was much lower in the community survey. So I think our results we get stronger results for everything in the workforce survey, stronger positive results. But you can see here we had a lot of police who answered those surveys as well. Okay, I won't say much more. But we did have more females than males answer the surveys. Okay, so here we have the main question: which aspects of women's police stations could improve how police stations respond to gender-based violence? And as you can see here, the workforce is blue and the community is red. But you can see here that there's a the workforce are hugely positive about 9 aspects of the way those specialist police stations work. You can see here that the community is a little less positive, but still they're positive about 9, and there's only 3 that are contentious. And the ones staffed by female police officers. Well, the ones in Argentina are not just staffed by female police officers, as I've already said. Now, the second key question was around how ideally should police respond to victims of gender-based violence. Hugely concurrent, and this was taken from the operational protocols of Argentina's police stations. Listen to victim stories about judging, help victims to remove offenders from the home, work from a gender perspective, empower victims to leave a violent partner, allow victims to choose a female officer. Really important. We do not allow them to choose the gender of their officer in Australia. But you can see here very strong support for that, and these are the operational protocols of how they work in Argentina. So how might we reimagine the policing of gender violence based on this model? Now, I know it's a paradox, and there has been some criticism that, look, women-led policing does embody a paradox. There is an unintended consequence. Some have argued it's a throwback, or it's like, that's where women were in policing in the 1970s. They were assigned to separate units, separate fields. It was a specialism that reinforces a gender inequality. And Rae Hemp argues that now, and she characterises Brazil's police stations as sort of backward. But I say this is a form of exactly metropolitan thinking. It's using the global north as a benchmark for measuring what's happening in the global south. It's also liberal feminists. It sees sameness as something that equates with gender equity, but it's not. In the province of Buenos Aires, there is absolutely no way is policing gender violence mainstream. They employ 2,300 officers alongside teams. And they have offered a structural problem to a structural solution. So of these 2,300 employees, that's the police. In addition, there's the multidisciplinary teams. They responded to nearly 250,000 reports of domestic violence. They received more than 7,000 reports of sexual violence, and they account for 1 in 5. So this is not marginal. This is systemic, structural, huge investment in. And now I must say that Argentina is ranked 30th in the world for gender equity. Australia is ranked much lower at 50. Argentina is one of the lowest femicide rates in Latin America. It has a lower femicide rate than Oceania, which the region we're in, and it's gone from, in one generation, it's gone from a country where the police systematically murdered, abducted, raped women and were part of a military dictatorship to being completely and utterly the defenders of women's safety. So, okay, so our argument then is, just to sort of wrap up, is that these particular specialist stations are women-led, they're victim-centred, they're absolutely designed to meet the needs of survivors. They don't take away their autonomy from the state. The multidisciplinary teams offer a whole way of reframing policing. The police have to have specialist training. So it weeds out the police who may be perpetrators. It weeds out the police who don't want to be involved in policing domestic violence. Okay. As I said, only a third ever go down the criminal justice path. But it also encourages trust. It encourages early intervention. It encourages women to come forward much earlier in that cycle of domestic violence before it becomes lethal. So that's another reason why they're so preventative. But they also, ironically, re-legitimise police in communities where they're really problematic. So they have a hugely transformative potential, and this is why we think this model is a source for inspiring our countries, Australia, UK, America, Canada, how we can completely reimagine how we police gender violence to sidestep all those problems of and many of them unintended problems of criminalisation. Now, I know I haven't got much time, but sneak preview, we have done and are doing a massive rollout of this research in Canada and the UK. And as you can see here, the UK, Canada and UK, the UK results are not final yet, but you can see very strong results. very strong, and working in multidisciplinary teams, police alongside others, it has got responses from 75 to 90%. So you can see that this model is something that is really hitting around the world in these countries. So we also collected a whole lot of qualitative data. Here's what one Australian domestic violence worker said. Here's another one, what a Canadian domestic violence worker said. And here's something else that a UK domestic violence worker said. Really think female police stations could be really effective. They would allow women to feel more at ease, which could also mean they will be more comfortable to disclose, blah, 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 blah. I love the idea. So you get the idea that the workers in the sector absolutely love the idea. Some police love the idea. Some police are deeply resistant. Okay, thank you very much for listening. And I'm at 6:41, right on time.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kerry, for an absolutely fascinating and really full presentation. And if I can just add my thanks to you, Kerry, on behalf of the wider SCCJR, for a really thought-provoking and insightful and really intellectually interesting presentation. Thank you so much. And I know we all can't clap on Zoom, but you know, thank you from all of us. It's been great.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. And check out the webpage and check out the videos. There is a website with lots more information, lots more of the publications, and also I'm looking for a partner in Scotland. If anyone wants to roll the survey out. Oh, yeah, I've got one. Okay, Michele, I'll be in contact with you. We are going to go to New York, but we just wanted to wait for things to calm down. But yes, we have got partners in New York, but we're just waiting for just not the right moment to do that yet. Yes, so we do aim to roll this study out across the world. Okay, and I thank Ben for his question. Okay.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your questions. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.